Hi, and welcome to the Inner Critic Masterclass. I'm Annalie Howling, and I'm really honoured that you'll be joining me here today. If you've been following me on social media, perhaps Instagram or TikTok, you may be familiar with some of my work around the inner critic. It's an area that I feel so passionately about. It's something that unites all of us. It's a common enemy, if you will. Or is it? We're going to explore more of that today in this masterclass together. So if you're ready, let us begin. There's a question that I ask at the beginning of every workshop that I do. I'm often asked about this now in podcasts. And it's a very simple question that we're all really familiar with. How are you feeling? But before you answer, even to yourself, there's a rule. You're not allowed to answer with the stock phrases that we give. I'm good, I'm fine, I'm okay. Surface level. That's also a territory for the inner critic when we answer questions in that way. It's so above the surface. We're not really leaning in. We're not checking in with ourselves. And we're certainly not giving the other person asking us that question the opportunity to get to know us. So I'm going to give you an example of what I mean if somebody asks me how I'm feeling. Today, I'm tired. I've done 2 terrific work days. One was a late night meeting a wonderful client that could be great for my business. But I was home late and my daughter, whom I have alone in the house, woke up in the night and I was very upset that she didn't know where I was. So I had a broken night's sleep. Then yesterday I did a terrific day of team coaching with a wonderful client that I love, but there was a lot of preparation work and I was doing that with my tank half empty. And so that was a lot of energy out. It was performance. And today I had this scheduled to film this masterclass, which I'm delighted about. It makes me feel so purposeful. I feel connected to you right now, knowing that I'm doing something that will, I hope, help you have a relationship with your inner critic. But I'm tired, and it's okay. When I'm tired, it makes me feel quite emotional. I'm a lot more vulnerable to being triggered, say. I'm a lot more vulnerable to, if I was to look on social media, maybe feel badly about myself, perhaps compare myself to somebody. So I know that right now, I need to do whatever it is that I can to stabilize my energy so that I don't continue to feel like this, so that it doesn't get worse. So the answer to the question of how am I feeling is I am good. I am fine. I'm definitely okay. But I'm also all of those things that I just mentioned. They're very real for me right now in this moment. So before you answer that question, which you have in the workbook, there's also the slide, or even just pause this, please. Take a deep breath and answer honestly. How are you feeling in this moment? What were you doing before you turned on this workshop today? Have you been meaning to get around to it? Was it something that you couldn't wait to do? Has something been going on in your life that you felt that you really needed some answers? What have you had to do in work today, in your personal life, friendships, relationships, your responsibilities? What has been happening in your day, just even leading up to this moment right now? And I want to tell you, as I named, emotion is really, really normal. When I deliver this question, particularly when I was doing these conferences and seminars over lockdown, and I'd be using a computer and Zoom, and I'd have hundreds and hundreds of screens and people, I would see the most screens turn off in the first minute when I asked this question. And then I would get the most email responses saying, I'm so sorry, I couldn't keep my camera on. I was so upset because I was having to reflect on really where I was. So I'd love for you to take this moment to pause and really check in with yourself and answer that question. How am I feeling? And you cannot write good, fine, or okay. The reason that we ask this question is it's important to understand exactly where we are. So I named how I was feeling today. If I was an iPhone battery, for example, if I'm thinking about my phone, right now I'd be at about 35%. So I can definitely perform, I can keep going, but I'm going to run out of juice. I'm going to run out of gas quite soon. So I've had to clear my evening schedule to make sure that I can put in time for renewal so that tomorrow I wake up with a battery that I hope is much closer to full charge, 100%. And then I can get all of my daily tasks done. Now, if we date back to when we used to live in community, this is why it's even more important to know where we really are. If we're living in community and our responsibilities are survival, if my job today was to go and collect something like the firewood or keep the fire going, which was the key to staying warm, cooking food, it was literally the centre point to survival. That is not a sensible role for me to take on today. I'm likely to drop the ball. So it's much better that I do something with less responsibility today, and then tomorrow when my tank is full, that's the time for me to come back out and take on a more onerous task or one that carries more responsibility, perhaps supporting others. So when we give these surface level answers of good, fine and okay, we're not only showing up at all with where we're actually at, we're not giving someone the opportunity to truly get to know us or have some vulnerability in conversation. And we're also not giving permission to another person to share. Whenever I ask this question in team or corporate settings, the responsibility and the response and the shift and the change in the dynamic is instant when people are sharing how they're really feeling, and the development in that team and that relationship system changes completely. Try asking someone that you love, a loved one. Find out really how they are feeling as well. Give them the permission and the space and ask that question. You'll be very surprised, and it's your inner critic trying to keep you at that surface level of good, fine and okay, trying to keep people away from your heart, from what's really going on with you. So today, for yourself, how are you feeling? Tomorrow and in the future, create the space for other people. It's an incredible gift. So what is the inner critic? I imagine I don't have to tell you. You're here joining me for this masterclass, so you probably have a relationship with your inner critic already. But we're going to transform this over the masterclass and turn it into a more positive experience and gain some wisdom. The inner critic goes by a number of different names. I use the term inner critic, but there's imposter syndrome, there's the saboteur, there's the ego, there's your ego not being your amigo, there's the judge. The inner critic goes by a variety of different names. So that's one thing to mention, but they're all united in the same thing. And fundamentally, the inner critic is that negative self-talk. You can't, you won't, you'll be laughed at if. It's all of those things that are going on and on in different situations in our life, at work, in our relationships, be they friendships or romantic, family systems, and just choices that we want to make. Our inner critic is the thing that always has our ear. I say to a lot of my clients, it's as if you're driving along and you're listening to the radio and you're having quite a happy song and you're going along nicely, and all of a sudden, before you realise, you're feeling really low and you're getting this negative self-talk cycle, and the radio's jumped to radio inner critic. And all it is a dialogue about all the things you can't do and the reasons why, and you don't realise how long you've been driving along listening to it. That is the inner critic. How do you know when it's the inner critic? There's a fairly easy way of telling. The inner critic always is lack. It doesn't have a love language. The inner critic has a lack language. And it goes something like this. This is your only chance. If you don't do this now, that's it, it's gone forever. This is your last chance. Well, that's a good idea, but they've had that idea. They've done it first. There's not space for you in that industry. There's no point. What's the point in trying? You'll never do it like them. You'll never be as good. There's no point doing it now. Oh, why even bother trying? There's not enough for you here. There's not enough money. You'll never earn enough money. You can't keep hold of money. You're not good with money. There's no point you trying to do this. That's the voice of the inner critic. It comes from a lack space. There's not enough. You cannot. It won't. That's how you always know that you're tuned in to the inner critic. So I believe that we as a collective, and you joining me here today, We're actually at an inferno of imposter syndrome, of the inner critic. I believe that most people are walking around acting from the place of their inner critic. It's a mask that we wear, and we wear this mask to be accepted. We think that we need to fit in, we need to be a certain way to be liked, and I'll talk more about that later, and I'll talk also about how we can solve that. But if we think about the collective, if we think about everyone that we're interacting with, if we think about all of our relationships and however we're meeting people and showing up, and if all of us are doing that wearing a mask, fundamentally, we're denying genuine connection. Just like that question at the very beginning, how are you feeling? And us giving the surface level examples of good, fine and okay, because that comes from the inner critic. That comes from the mask. It comes from that protective layer, because we're all trying to hold ourselves back. Call it your inner child, call it your inner self, whatever you will. But all of us are walking around having interactions in our day-to-day life, and we're fundamentally denying ourselves the opportunity for joy, the opportunity for real connection, because we're not fully showing up. And that's the inner critic doing it to you. And this is where I believe we are as a collective right now. And I am absolutely delighted that you are here to join me to try and change that. I want to talk a little bit about the trauma and shame cycle and how that can impact the inner critic. If you are familiar with my work at all from social media, you'll know that I'm a trauma-informed therapist. I work with EMDR, and it's something that has transformed my own practice. Coaching is incredible. I think coaching is the most wonderful program, and everyone should undertake some coaching if you have the opportunity. But for me, I was doing coaching for years and years and years, and have trained in various modalities, and there was just something missing. And that something was trauma work. And as soon as I unlocked that for myself, during the breakdown of my marriage in the early days to help heal a lot of things about myself, I then undertook the training and took that into my work that I'm doing with clients now. And I want to impart some of that for yourselves. I think you have to have the full picture of perhaps why our inner critic is kicking in and what it's doing to protect us. So this is what I want to explain. You have the slide in the workbook should you wish to look at it, and it'll pop up on the screen as well. So when we experience trauma logs shame into our system. And an important thing for me to say about trauma is trauma can be something that you've witnessed. Quite often we think, well, I don't have PTSD. I've not been a veteran in the armed forces, or I haven't had a big accident or anything like that. It's not the case. Trauma can manifest from so many different things. I've had clients come in saying they saw something as children that their childhood brain obviously couldn't fully understand, and their parents being kind, telling them, oh, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. And it's just left this cycle that can't close, this emotional charge, this cycle in their system. You know when you've experienced something traumatic as well, even if it isn't a big event, or so you feel, because you're living your life, but you're starting to change what you're doing and you're living differently. So I'll give you an example of something that's happened to me. When I was in my early 20s, I was renting a flat in London, and there was a cat in the apartment, and it was quite early one summer's morning and had been out the night before. I remember it was very, very early in the morning, but it was light. It was a summer's day. And I heard the cat scratching in the wardrobe in my bedroom. I thought, oh, cat. So stumbled up, half asleep, opened the wardrobe doors. Cat wasn't in there, but the scratching was so loud. Oh God, cat's outside my window. So I turned to my window, which in this flat in London, if anyone's familiar, are these big double height sash windows with curtains in front. And as I pulled back the curtains in my bedroom to get the cat, there wasn't a cat there. There was a man stood this far from my face, through a pane of glass, but this far from my face, trying to get my window up. And in that moment, I was so afraid that I froze on the spot. There was not a single sound to my mind that came out of my mouth. I remember that he was saying, sorry, love, as he was trying to get the window up. Now, some noise must have been made because my flatmate came running in and did all the things that I wished I'd done. He was in fight. So he banged on the window. This guy jumped down. It was the first 2 floors of a maisonette. He then went out and chased him down the street. And I'd been in freeze. Now, the police came later and then they told me how lucky I was that he wasn't here to attack me or anything like that. He was known to the police as someone that would have been coming in and getting some electrical goods. Wasn't I lucky? So someone in authority also told me that I was lucky. So that's what I left with. That's what I left that whole interaction with. But I also left with a huge amount of shame. The shame being that when that happened, my response, that freeze, what it told me was that in that moment, and in any other moment if something terrifying might happen to me, I would have the same response. That's what I believed. I thought if anything scary happened to me, my system would do what it did then and just freeze and I wouldn't be able to cope. And I developed an underlying limiting belief. That's what happens with trauma. And my underlying limiting belief is I am helpless, I am hopeless, and I am weak. And I went through my life from 21 with that as a lens that I looked at the world through. Now, I still took on challenges, I still did certain things, I still had relationships, but fundamentally, I had this belief of myself. And so I'm using this lens to make choices in my life, a lens of being helpless, hopeless, and weak. That is what trauma does. And then that's where the inner critic is trying to protect you from. So shame is an I am statement. If you take a minute to think about if anything I'm saying is resonating, again, it might be something you've witnessed, it might be something that you've experienced yourself, it leaves you with an I am. I am weak, I am a failure, I am unsafe, I am not enough, I am unworthy. Any of these things could be an I am statement, but you know if it's true when you think about one of these events because it makes you feel quite unwell. It actually usually makes you feel quite physically sick. Shame is really hard to describe because it's a felt sense. Trauma is a felt sense in your system, and it's very different to guilt. If I'm unskillful with my daughter, I'm a bit ratty and tired, like today, I might not be as patient as normal. I could say to a friend, oh gosh, do you know what, I really didn't do well today with my daughter. I wasn't great today at being a parent. I feel guilty about that. I feel bad about that. That's guilt. If I say to a friend, I did really badly with my daughter today, I am a bad parent, that is shame. I feel ill saying that. I am a bad parent. That is the sensation of shame. So I really want to explain that. And the thing that I also want to talk about is all of the trauma responses and how they work. When I went into freeze, I didn't choose it. Now, I didn't know this for almost 20 years. It wasn't a choice. Your system, when it has the first hint of something dangerous, automates a trauma response. And there are 5 trauma responses. Fight, go in and try and attack like my flatmate did. Flight, run. Freeze, the one that I took on, just so terrified you freeze. Flop, passing out. And fawn. And not enough is spoken about with fawn. Fawn isn't just when you're in a narcissistic relationship system or you find yourself potentially in a relationship where there might be domestic violence. Fawn can also be if you have a difficult relationship with a boss or a co-worker. But fawn is when you are acting from a trauma response, which is automatic, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second, to keep you safe, to stop you from dying. That's what your body thinks will happen. And that can be stored as shame as well. So the way that the trauma response happens, if I go back to that example with the burglary, as soon as I realised that was not the cat on the window, my body started going into trauma. So all the blood from my prefrontal cortex, which is the area of my brain at the centre at the front, which stores dates, times, cognitive functioning, if you will, and the Broca's area, which is my language centre, which sits just behind, all of that went offline, all of it. Not needed right now. We are in danger. The blood flow instead is going to my limbic system, my amygdala, which is the animal, the more reptilian part of my brain. That is where the fight, flight, freeze, flop and fawn responses live, because right now I need to be out of danger. I don't need to know what the time is or what the date is or what I need to buy from the supermarket or any of those things. I need to stay alive. So you don't select. This part of the brain acts so much faster. So I can't think rationally or cognitively. I'm in emotion. I'm in response here instead. I'm in fight, flight, freeze, flop form. So equally, when you're having arguments, debates, and people are saying, stop being so emotional, if you're feeling in any way unsafe, you actually can't. You're going into this part of your brain. You're being triggered. You're going into survival zone. You can see my posture changing. We start, and that's where you're going into. But your brain is always tagging. Your brain is always tagging things that you might need later. Now, what happens is that emotional cycle, unless you have some healing work and you can work through that in a variety of different ways, EMDR being only one of them, the cycle remains open. And that underlying limiting belief, that I am, stays lodged in your system. And that can become a lens that you start viewing the world through. That was what I was doing for years until I understood this work. And I'm sure that some of this is resonating with you now. So I would like to invite you to take a moment now to just write in the workbook or a journal, or just take a minute for yourself and think about any events that perhaps you've experienced, you've witnessed, anything that resonates from what I'm saying, and then go through with the I am statement as well. What's the I am statement? You'll know, as I say, you often get a very physical reaction to that I am statement, that felt sense. And that is an limiting belief, an underlying limiting belief that your inner critic is actually kind of guarding and protecting you from. And I'll be showing you in a minute how it's trying to do its job to look after you, and then how we can move past that and work in partnership with it. So I've talked about how my approach to the inner critic is different, and I'd like to introduce that to you now. So I firmly believe, from all of my work in this area and all of my years of work with clients, that the inner critic is not the enemy. The inner critic is a really well-meaning friend that's got it a bit wrong. The inner critic, if I asked you, how long have you been aware of this negative self-talk, of this voice? A really long time. It's been with you probably longer than most people in your life that you can think about. It's something that you're really familiar with, and it's desperately trying to do a job of protecting you. And I'll explain more about what I mean. When we talked at the very beginning, the how are you feeling question, and I said about us living in community and needing to stay safe by being connected and being together, and us people pleasing by giving answers that we think people want to hear. That's us playing into our inner critic, trying to keep us connected. There's a very famous study which talks about the fears that we have as humans. And number one is not the fear of death. That, in fact, ranks as number 7. The first fear is rejection. So we're the most afraid of being rejected. And actually that makes a great deal of sense if we go back to our physiology and living in these times. I believe that our software, if you like, just hasn't updated for the modern times that we find ourselves living in now. If we go back to when we're living in community together, if I was rejected because I'd said or done something that didn't fit in with the group dynamic, I would die. And that would have been a horrible death, to be ostracized from the group of that way. All of my basic needs, food, water, shelter, would not have been met. I would have been isolated and out on my own. It would have been certain death, and it would have been really quite horrible. So our software, our physiology has not upgraded to meet the fact that I do live on my own. This is my house. I live here on my own with my daughter, quite happily. I'm able to run my own life. Modern living is such that we're all able to do that. But our physiology hasn't upgraded. We still have these beautiful ancient systems, like the amygdala, the animal brain that kicks in with trauma. We need to understand that to be better able to work with it and respect it, and then help us move on. So this inner critic, this role that it's playing, it's desperately trying to keep you connected. It's trying to stop you from being rejected. So how does it do that? The only way it knows how: by keeping you safe. And how can it try and keep you safe? By doing what you've always done. And that means keeping you in your comfort zone. Have you ever noticed when you're going to try and do something like for the first time, maybe a big challenge, a bungee jump, a race, or go on a date, do something, a give a talk, something where you're going to be outside of your comfort zone, try a new business idea, anything like that, have you noticed that that's when your inner critic gets the loudest? Of course it does, because you're about to break out of your comfort zone. So in that moment, it is throwing everything it's got, kind of all the stuff in the kitchen sink, every worry, every lack statement, every thing it can think of from your, do you remember when you were 7 and that didn't work out, or this awful thing, or how embarrassed you felt when that happened at that party. It's going to chuck everything at you in that moment because it's desperately trying to cling on to you from growing, from going outside of its comfort zone, because when you step out of there into the unknown, it can't protect you. It can't guarantee your connection, your community, your safety. So it tries to keep you inside the comfort zone. That doesn't sound like a terrible thing to me. Like I say, it's your well-meaning friend that's got it wrong. Now, I am absolutely not excusing or saying that the language that it uses is positive for us. It's not. I'm not saying that the negative self-talk cycles are not utterly exhausting, because I know that they are. Believe me, I know that they are. And I also believe that, again, as a collective, we are exhausted. So when I see all of these books or ideas or talks or anything to do with it, which is crush your critic or the ego is the enemy, and I understand, and I'm not belittling any of it, I just don't think we've got it in us to fight something else, especially something that lives within us. What I think we have within us is intellect, desire to lean into the wisdom, to understand ourselves better, and to use that as a shift forwards to work in partnership and in dynamic with our inner critic. And that's what I'm going to show you to do in the next exercise. Welcome back from the Befriending Your Inner Critic exercise. As I said at the beginning of that exercise, there's no right and there's no wrong. Perhaps you didn't get the strongest connection. You feel like there's something wrong with you. There isn't. You can do it again as many times as you want. Maybe it's just a felt sense and an opportunity to take a break, listen to my voice and do some journaling. All of these things are absolutely right for you. You've probably heard me speak about this before if you're familiar with some of my work, and it's should versus want. And should is also the language of the inner critic. It's a good way of being able to tell early, if you like, an early warning sign that you're listening again to the inner critic. And I say that the inner critic gives us a great big pile of shoulds. I actually believe that should be a swear word. It's something that is a pressure on ourselves, and it's always, again, for other people or a society expectation that we think we need to meet. I should lose weight. I should enjoy this type of exercise. I should spend more time with these people. I should say yes to that, or I might not get invited again. I should be enjoying my job. I should be happy in this relationship. I've got all these things that should make me happy, but I feel really unfulfilled. Should. Sound tiring? Should is exhausting. Should is that fuel of the inner critic, again, just layering and layering and layering things onto us that takes us further away from our center and further away from ourselves, and often into quite toxic and unhealthy dynamics. The best thing that you can do in these situations is quiet down that voice and understand and discuss with yourself what it is that you want. Want is a very different energy and a very different answer to should. So I should say yes to that invitation. I should go to that event. If I'm checking in with myself again today about how I'm feeling, I've cancelled an event tonight because I want to regain my energy. I want to regain my balance. I want to finish this week level, not under, not in a deficit. That's what I want to do. So I've done it. We can't be afraid of doing what we want. There's a big dichotomy around being selfish and self-care. And in my view, self-care is the want, but it's knowing what's right for us. So when you're selfish, it's that you're acting in your own self-interest at the detriment of somebody else. You're hurting somebody else. You're taking advantage of them. You're doing something that's going to impact that other person negatively, and you're knowingly doing that. When we're employing self-care, we're acting in our self-interest because it will better nourish ourselves so that we're able to give that version ourselves to people that we care about and we love. I often use the example that if I'm doing a yoga class here and my young daughter goes to bed, I maybe feel guilty about that, or I should make sure that she's asleep fully, or I should ensure that she's happy first. If I don't do the yoga class, she gets ratty, tired mummy. I don't sleep as well, my mood isn't as level, I haven't nourished my mind or honoured my body in that way. The best gift that we can give to those that we love is our own joy. That gives me joy. She gets happy mummy from me doing that. So it's really important to differentiate between should and want. What I've just discussed there is a boundary. So boundaries is the next slide or next page in your workbook. And boundaries are a very trendy word. It's something that's bandied around a huge amount and they're incredibly popular. But they're also something that triggers your inner critic like almost nothing else, especially when you've got established groups and relationships. How can I suddenly put a boundary in with a family member when they've always been used to having access to me in a certain way? How can I put a boundary in with a friendship group when I've always performed a certain role or said that I liked something and maybe I don't? Boundaries are something that are there to protect relationships that we care about. If you think about it, relationships that we don't care about so much, we probably let them slide and drift and, lose touch however we might. Boundaries that we really value, it's important to put them into relationships of value. So what's important to me that I need a boundary for? My energy. I want to put that into relationships with friendships or people that matter to me to make sure that both of them can be retained and maintained in my life with me feeling good and other people feeling good as well. There's a story about the boiling frog, which is an experiment, pretty cruel, pretty horrible, but was carried out in the 1800s by a scientist called Louis Pasteur. And what they did, these scientists, was they got a huge pot of boiling water on the stove. And they took a frog and they popped that frog in that pot of boiling water. What do you think happened to that frog? Froggy hit the boiling water and went, "Ah, this is horrible, it's absolutely boiling." And it jumped out and hopped off around the lab trying to cool its fin down. Well, the scientists were not done. They took the pot of boiling water, they turned the heat off it, and they allowed it to cool right down to room temperature. Nice and cool. They went and got the frog and they popped it back in this pot of water. What do you think happened to the frog this time? Froggy swam. Amphibious creature, cool, big pot of water, delightful, doing its backstroke, having a swim, much nicer here, thank you so much. But those scientists were not done. What they did this time was they turned up that pot of boiling water 1 degree at a time until slowly, finally, that pot reached boiling point again. What do you think the frog did this time? It did nothing. It kept swimming until eventually it died. That frog adapted to the water because it was a gradual increase of heat. As humans, we have an unbelievable ability to adapt, to expand, but it's not always healthy for us. We find ourselves in situations like that pot of boiling water that if we were to enter it now, we wouldn't be able to cope and we wouldn't accept it. But over time, we say yes more, we take on more, until we find ourselves at boiling point again. But we've adapted so far over time, we don't know how to get back to that cool point again and be in charge of our life. The way to do it is boundaries. And I'm also fairly sure that in that inner critic exercise, whatever came up for you at the end will be somewhere that you need to stop doing something and giving some of your energy away. That is what a boundary is for, so that we don't end up boiling over in any of the people that matter to us in our relationships, so that our inner critic isn't having to protect us, and so that we can keep people in our life that we really value. So a question to you now: in what way have you become like that boiling frog? Where in your life do you need to put some boundaries in place to bring that water down for you? Where is it that you need to save and protect your energy or key relationships by saying no instead of yes? And where is it that you need to focus on what it is that you want, not what you feel you should do? Thank you so much for joining me for this masterclass about the inner critic. I hope that through this journey together, you feel better equipped and better educated about yourself. As I mentioned throughout, it's really important for me to empower people with knowledge of why things are happening. In my own personal journey, in the work that I do with clients, the thing that makes the real difference is when you feel that you understand why things are happening, which gives you a sense of control rather than feeling out of control. We've covered off how we want to show up, really how we're feeling, interacting with people, and about how your inner critic is desperately just trying to keep you safe, and you can work in partnership together rather than needing to fight it. They're a well-meaning friend that's just got it a bit wrong, and we can help them along in that journey by giving them some space and the stage to listen to them, and by honouring our own path, putting boundaries in place to protect our energy and relationships that we really do care about, and living a life authentically without a mask, a way of showing up and deeply connecting to people that we care about, and having a life of authenticity and value in whatever it is that we're doing. For those of you that have bought the relationship section, we'll be moving on to that next. And I'm so, so grateful for all of you joining me here. It makes a huge difference. And this is a movement like the imposter inferno I talked about. If we can live our lives without the mask that the inner critic is encouraging us to wear, and we're joining each other from a place of authenticity, imagine the change that you can see in your community, and we're spreading it out wide. So what I would ask you to do is, having listened to this, one of the promises that you made to yourself, either something you were going to stop doing or something you were going to start doing, please tag me. I'd love to see it. Please share something on Instagram, tag me at Annalie Howling, and we can celebrate and share this journey together. And what it will do is give courage to somebody else. Let part of this journey be the pay it forward, that help us high, when you can really be courageous and inspire someone else who I promise you is sitting there with their own inner critic thinking that they can't do it, and they can. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart. And I really look forward to engaging with you and hearing about how your inner critic is becoming your cheerleader. Thank you.